they have one process created, process A, and you're running a loop for 5 times. Just they are checking buffer of I greater than 0. So then increment the counter. So 5 times this particular loop will be executed, and you will be incrementing the counter. So it will become 5. So same way process B. So there's another process which is doing the same thing. So again, you're incrementing the counter. So 5 times the counter will get executed, and you're creating the thread in the main. So for process A and process B. So both the like process A and process B, you are creating it as two different threads. From the main, you are created the thread. So in turn, these two threads will be executed, and this is 5 times, and this particular loop will get executed 5 times. So when you see from a programmer perspective, the value of the counter will be 10. So that means 5 for the process A and 5 for process B. So totally it will count as 10 at the end of the execution of the process A and B. So that is from the programmer perspective. So, but it need not be always in a real world execution of this piece of code under a multitasking kernel. So you may not expect always the counter value will become 10 in the real time execution of this particular piece of code, because it is going to perform its operation in the multitasking kernel. So again, the results depend on the process scheduling policies adopted by the OS kernel. So you need to check out with the process, like a scheduling process, which scheduling technique they have used. So how much time they are using it for a particular process to be executed. Depending upon that also, the counter value will vary. So that is what we call it as synchronization issues in the task communication and synchronization issues. So we have some definitions, important definitions need to see here with respect to the operating system. So the very first word we are going to see here is deadlock. So I think already you would have learned in the operating system subject. What do you mean by deadlock? It's a condition which produces incorrect results. Like, sorry, a race condition is nothing but it produces incorrect results. But a deadlock condition, it creates a situation where none of the processes are able to make any progress in their execution. So suppose one process is in execution and it enters the deadlock state, means it will not be able to, like any other processes will not be able to make progress in their execution. So resulting in a set of deadlocked processes. So in the simplest form, deadlock is the condition in which a process is waiting for a resource held by the first process. So there are some processes are running, and first process is using some resource, and the second process also wants that particular resource which is held by the first process, and without that particular resource, second process will not be able to execute its next part of the instructions. So that time it becomes deadlock. So you will be calling that situation as the deadlock. So there's another term which you need to understand, mutual exclusion. So that is nothing but the criteria that only process can hold a resource at time. So like a process can hold a resource at a time, the process should access shared resources with mutual exclusion. So that means the same resources need to be accessed by many processes. So one process, if it holds that particular resource for a long duration, and the other processes which requires that particular resources are going to suffer. So it will go for deadlock condition. So to avoid that, you are going to have a time. So specific time will be given till that time the first process has to hold that resource, and after that it has to release that particular process, and then the second process can use that particular resource whichever it is required. So that is nothing but mutual exclusion. And then hold and wait. So the condition in which a process holds a shared resource by acquiring the lock controlling the shared access and waiting for additional resources held by other processes. So already the process holds the or acquires the resources from the shared access, and it is going to wait for additional resources which are held by the other processes. So that condition we call it as hold and wait. Then no resource preemption. So the criteria that operating system cannot take back a resource from a process which is currently holding it, and the resource can only be released voluntarily by the process holding it. So suppose one process is holding the resource and it is making use of that. So the operating system cannot take back that resource from a process which is currently holding that particular resource, and that resource can only be released by the process which is holding it voluntarily. So that particular process only has to release that uh, resource whichever it is holding. So that is nothing but no resource preemption. Then you have circular wait, so which is nothing but n number of processes are running and the process is waiting for a resource which is currently held by another process. Again in turn it is waiting for a resource held by the first process. Like again see here you'll be having p naught to pn processes. P naught is waiting for resource held by p1, again p1 is waiting for resource held by p2, like that. So up to n number of processes. So one after the other, it is waiting in a queue kind of thing. So waiting for a resource held by P naught, and P naught is waiting for a resource held by Pn, and so on. So this is going to form a kind of circular wait queue. So we'll, in a manner kind of circle kind of thing, you are going to form a circular wait queue. So that is nothing but circular wait queue. And then deadlock handling. So a smart operating system may foresee the deadlock condition and will act proactively to avoid such a situation. So you need to have the handling, deadlock handling also. So some of the operating system will look into this kind of deadlock conditions and they will act accordingly, and they will avoid the situation of deadlock. So suppose if a deadlock occurs, how the operating system is going to respond to it. So it is different. One operating system will take care of this deadlock handling in a different manner. It is not of kind uniform, it is a non-uniform kind. So sometimes you need to ignore the deadlocks also. So assume that the system design is a deadlock free, and this is acceptable for the reason of cost of removing a deadlock is large compared to the chance of happening deadlock. So that means if deadlock happens, so coming out of that particular deadlock is a challenging one. So instead, we can avoid happening a deadlock to happen. So Unix is an example of this following principle where it makes use of ignoring the deadlocks. And then detect and recovery. So this is nothing but the approach suggests the detection of a deadlock situation and recovery from it. So it is going to detect how where the deadlock situation has occurred and how to recover from it. So this is nothing but similar to the deadlock condition that may arise at traffic junction. You would have observed how in the traffic junction it can be removed, how you are going to detect the deadlock and you will be able to remove it. So operating system is going to keep a graph kind of thing, resource graph in their memory. So this resource graph is updated on each resource request and release. So whatever the resource request the processes are going to give, and then how much time that resource is going to be utilized by that particular process, and when that resource is going to be released by that particular process. So for all these things, operating system is going to keep track of a graph kind of thing. So a deadlock condition can be detected by analyzing this particular resource graph by the analyzer algorithms. There will be some algorithms to analyze this particular graph. So this deadlock condition is going to be detected by analyzing this particular resource graph, which will be present in the memory. Then avoid deadlocks. So deadlock is avoided by the careful resource allocation techniques by the operating system. So if you follow carefully the scheduling algorithms and then resource allocation to this particular process, so suppose n number of processes are running, so for which process how much time is going to be allocated for this particular resource. So if you carefully allocate all these resources and properly it is going to be handled, you will be able to avoid the deadlock conditions. So like how you are going to avoid the traffic jams in the junctions. So then prevent deadlock. One is avoid deadlock and the other one is prevent deadlock. So prevent the deadlock condition by negating one of the four conditions favoring the deadlock situation. So you have to, like some four conditions are there where you will be able to enter into the deadlock. So you are going to do the opposite of that, negate that particular one of the conditions which favors or which moves your process to go to the deadlock. So by avoiding the deadlock, you are going to prevent the deadlock condition to happen. So ensure that a process does not hold any other resources when it requests a resource. So ensure that resource preemption is possible at operating system level. So this can be achieved by implementing the following set of rules or guidelines in resource allocation and releasing. So if you follow these kind of rules and then guidelines, you will be able to avoid or prevent the deadlock condition. So one is the leave lock condition, which is similar to the deadlock condition, except that a process in leave lock condition in that state with time. So it will be with respect to the time. So while in deadlock, a process enters in a wait state for a resource and continues in that state forever without making any progress. So if your process enters to a deadlock condition, and it will enter a wait state wherein you will be staying in that wait state forever without making any progress. Any further progress will not be done in the execution of the completion. But the live lock condition is better explained with a real world example, like two people are attempting to cross each other in a corridor. So for some time it will happen. So you will come from this side and the other person will come from that side, and you will see 1 or 2 minutes this side, that side, and then anyone will stop and leave the way for the other one. So that is nothing but a leave lock condition. Starvation is nothing but the, in multitasking context, starvation is a condition in which a process does not get the resources required to continue its execution for a long time. So that is nothing but starvation. So whenever you are running your process or task in multitasking kind, so it is the condition in which the process does not get the resources which is required by that particular process to continue its execution for a long duration. So that time you are going to enter into a state called as starvation or starved state. So these are some of the important definitions you need to remember with respect to the RTOS. So next is mutual exclusion through sleep and wake up. So the busy waiting mutual exclusion enforcement mechanism used by the processors makes the CPU always busy by checking the log to see whether they can proceed. So this is going to result in a wastage of CPU time and leads to higher power consumption. So this is not affordable in embedded systems, because in embedded systems you will be using a battery for the power things and all. So you may not go with this kind of condition where you're going to use the battery for a longer duration. So since it affects the battery backup time of the device. So for that, an alternative to busy waiting is a sleep and wake up mechanism. So you are just going to enter to the sleep mode, and whenever it is required, you will on that particular process. So when a process is not allowed to access the critical section, which is currently being locked by another process. So suppose a process wants to access some portion or some of the resources, but that resource is already held by another process. So till that time, this process is going to be in a waiting or busy waiting state. So in that situation, your battery will also drain out. So that in that situation, that process which is waiting for that particular resource which is used by another process, it undergoes sleep and it is going to enter the blocked state. So to avoid the power draining out, because your embedded systems are going to work with backup with battery only, powered with backup battery only. So that is the reason you have to see into or look into all these aspects. So we are going to discuss one more term here called as semaphore, which is a sleep and wake up based mutual exclusion implementation for shared resource access. So semaphore is nothing but it's a sleep and wake up based mutual exclusion implementation for shared resource and resource access. Semaphore is a system resource, and the process which wants to access the shared resource can first acquire the system object to indicate other processes which wants the shared resources that the shared resource is currently acquired by it. So one process wants to access or acquire a shared resource. So it is going to indicate to the other processes that already this particular resource is with me. So it is going to signal or it is going to give the indication to the other process that this particular resource is already I have acquired and it is along with me. So the resources which are shared among a process can be either for exclusive use by a process or for using by a number of processes at a time. So in the shared resources, whatever the resources are available in the shared kind of thing, so that kind of resources, it can be used among a process exclusively specifically for that particular process, or it can be sometimes used by number of processes at a time. So the display device of an embedded system is a typical example of shared resources. So you will be having a display unit or a display device which will be used in many of the embedded systems. So which is a shared resource which needs exclusive access by a process. So again, you will be having hard disk of multiple processes. So various processes can access the different sectors of the hard disk concurrently. So in the hard disk also you will be having different sectors, and various processes will be accessing the different sectors which are present in the hard disk concurrently or simultaneously. So based on the implementation of the sharing limitation of the shared resources, semaphores are going to be classified into two types. One is binary semaphore and the other one is counting semaphore. So semaphores are going to be classified into two types. One is binary and the other one is counting. So in the binary semaphore, it provides exclusive access to the shared resources by allocating the resource to a single process at a time. So in the binary semaphore, what it does is the shared resource will be allocated to a single process at a particular time, and not allowing the other processes to access it when it is being owned by another process. So the resource is going to be allocated to one single process in a particular time. So during that time, any other processes will not be able to access that particular resource. So counting semaphore maintains the count between 0 and some maximum value. So the second type of semaphore is counting semaphore. So in the counting semaphore, it maintains the count between 0 and maximum value. So it limits the resource to the maximum value of the count supported by it. So it is going to have a limit for the maximum value of the count, and the count associated with the semaphore object is decremented by 1 when a process or thread acquires it. So that means when a process gets a resource or acquires a resource, so that time you will be having a count which is associated with that particular object is going to be decremented by 1. And the count is going to be incremented by 1 when a process or thread releases the semaphore object. So suppose if the resource it releases, the process releases, that time the count is going to be incremented, and if the process holds the resource, that time the count will be decremented. So that is nothing but counting semaphore. So you'll be having this here, see initial count which is greater than 0, then you will be in the available state. So you are going to acquire. So if suppose the resource is going to be acquired, count will be decremented by 1. So count is equal to count minus 1. So suppose if you are releasing that resource, so count will be equal to count plus 1. So for release, count equals to 1. For acquire, count equals to 0. So acquire. So if this particular process is has acquired the resource, means the count will be decremented by 1 and it becomes 0. Then the resource will become unavailable. So suppose if the resource is released, then count will become 1. So that time the resource will become available. So like that, in the counting semaphores, it is going to maintain some value, maximum value, count value, and each time when the resource is held or acquired, it is decremented by 1, and each time it is released, the count value will be incremented by 1. So same way binary semaphore, it's a synchronization object provided by operating system for process or thread synchronization. So any process or thread can create mutex object, and other process or threads of the system can use this particular object for synchronizing the access to critical sections. So only one process or thread can own the object at a time. So the state of this object is set to signaled when it is not owned by any process or thread, and set to non-signaled when it is owned by any process or thread. So here it is going to, in binary semaphore, it is going to use signaling. So the state is nothing but it is going to be set to signaled when it is not owned by any process. Any resource, if it is not acquired or if it is not owned by any process, so it is going to indicate that using the signal, and then non-signal when it is owned by the process or thread. So this is available and unavailable state. So initial value equals to 1. Then when it is acquired, value will become 0, non-signal. So when it is released, the value will become 1. So available state. So that is how in the binary semaphores it makes use of this. So we have here, till now we have discussed many concepts in the real-time operating system. So after that, we need to know also how to choose a real-time operating system. So again, it depends upon the embedded systems, which embedded systems you are going to design for. So based on that, how exactly the RTOS or real-time operating system is going to be chosen. So the decision of choosing this particular RTOS for an embedded design is a very critical one, because a lot of factors need to be analyzed carefully before making a decision on the selection of an RTOS. So the factors can be considered as either functional or non-functional. So when it comes with the functional requirements, how to choose the RTOS based on the functional requirement. So first thing you have to see is processor support. So it is not necessary that all RTOS supports all kinds of processors or processor architecture. So you need to look into that embedded systems, each embedded system, how that embedded system is going to be designed and which type of processors you are using or controllers you are using. So based on that, you need to go for choosing the operating system also. So it is you will not be able to take a particular operating system or RTOS, and you should not expect that that is going to fit for all the kinds of processors. It will support for all the kinds of processor architecture. So you need to ensure the processor supports the RTOS. So that kind of RTOS you have to choose for that particular kind of embedded system application. So one is processor support. The second thing is memory requirement. So again, this is also very important because in embedded system, memory is very crucial. That means we will be using a very limited amount of memory. We cannot have a chip which is having larger value of memory in the embedded system. So since embedded system itself is a combination of more number of components, hardware, software, everything will be there. So you need to look into the compact way of installing your memories and all. So the operating system, it requires ROM memory for holding the OS files. And again, it will be normally stored in the non-volatile memory like flash. You'll be using flash memories. In that, your operating systems will be stored. So also it requires working memory RAM for loading the OS services. So you have to have loaders, linkers, all those things to load the operating systems. So that kind of things will be present in the RAM. So since embedded systems are memory constrained, so that is what I told. So embedded systems, you are going to use less amount of memory chips. So it is essential to evaluate the minimal ROM and RAM requirement for the operating system under consideration. So embedded systems, if you are going for the design, you need to look into all these aspects. So how much ROM and RAM is required for that particular embedded system. So whether that embedded system requires OS or not, that also you need to think. So small embedded systems and all will not require OS at all. So very few embedded systems will require OS. So based on all these things, the calculations need to be done. How much RAM and RAM values have to be used for that particular embedded system. Based on that, you need to decide the operating system which fits or which will be suitable for that particular memory requirement. Then comes the real-time capabilities, which is it is not mandatory that the operating system for all embedded systems need to be real-time, because there are some applications which are not dependent on real-time, non-real-time applications kind of thing. So for example, your washing machine, microwave oven, they are all non-real-time. So and all embedded operating systems are real-time in behavior. So based on these things, whether the embedded system is a real-time or non-real-time. So based on that capabilities also, you need to decide to choose the operating system. Then kernel and interrupt latency. So like the kernel of the operating system may disable interrupts while executing certain services. So you're executing certain services in the embedded system. So sometimes the kernel of the operating system may disable the interrupts, and it may lead to interrupt latency. That means that a particular interrupt whichever is raised has to wait. So it will lead to the latency. So for an embedded system whose response requirements are high, so that means the embedded systems are in high in response kind of thing. So this latency should be minimal. So you should have minimal or minimum amount of latency or waiting time for the interrupts. It should not go beyond the limit, because that particular embedded system has to respond quickly. So for that types of embedded systems, how to choose the operating system, and then the kernels which are used in the operating system, all those things you need to be taken care. Then inter-process communication and task synchronization. That is nothing but one process to the other process, how the communication will happen and how you're going to synchronize with the task, shifting the task from one process to the other process or thread to thread, all those things. So the implementation of inter-process communication and synchronization in OS kernel is dependent. So certain kernels may provide a bunch of options, whereas others provide very limited options. Again, it depends upon the operating system. Then modularization support. So mode of the operating system provides a bunch of features. At times, it may not be necessary for an embedded product for its functioning. It's very useful if the OS supports modularization, wherein which developer can choose the essential modules and recompile the operating system image for functioning. So modular way of using the operating system. Then support networking and communication. This is also required. OS kernel may provide stack implementation and driver support for a bunch of communication interfaces and networking. So if you are having the networking, all those things, how the communication should happen, how the network is to be supported, based on that also you have to choose the operating system. Then development language support. This is also important. So certain operating systems include the runtime libraries required for running applications written in languages like Java and C hash. So for that you require a JVM, which is customized for the operating system, which is essential for running Java applications. So similarly, .NET is required for .NET Compact framework is required for running your Microsoft .NET applications on the operating system. So for all these things, you need to take care, because you will be writing your code using different kinds of language. It might be C, C++, or C hash, or Java, embedded C. So many languages you are going to use. So it need to support that development language also, whichever the operating system you use. So all these comes under functional requirements for choosing the real-time operating system. So same way you have some non-functional real-time requirements for choosing the real-time operating system. So custom developed or half-shelf kind of thing. So depending upon the operating system requirement, it is possible to go for the complete development of an operating system suitable for the embedded system. Like you can take the operating system. Some operating systems are open source or openly available. You can get that operating systems, and according to your requirements, whatever the features you want to customize, so you can customize that. So based on the requirement of your embedded system design, your operating systems can also be designed, and you will be able to remove some of the features which is not required, and you will be able to add some of the features which you can add it. So that is kind of operating system design. And cost, like again the total cost for developing or buying the operating system. So whether you are going for already available operating system, or you're going to develop your own operating system for that. So again you will be looking into the cost as one of the non-functional requirement for building the operating system. So how to select the operating system. Then development and debugging tools availability. So again, availability of development and debugging tools is critical decision making factor in the selection of an operating system for embedded design. So which kind of debugging tools you have to use in the operating system, so which supports that particular embedded system design, everything you have to think. Then ease of use. So how easy it is to use a commercial RTOS. Again, that is also another feature that needs to be considered. So whenever you choose any operating system, so that operating system should be user friendly, like it should be very easy to use. So it should not give trouble. So that kind of operating system you need to choose. Then after sales, again for a commercial embedded RTOS, after sales in the form of email, on-call services, etc. Again for bug fixes, critical patch updates, and support for production issues, etc. So once you get the operating system, so again if something happens to that operating system, so whether the persons are there for services on call, or they are going to fix the bugs, which whatever the problem you are going to encounter when you are using that particular real-time operating system. So that and all you need to see. So if they are not supporting and you will not be able to fix the problem, then your whole embedded system will become a failure. So that is the reason you need to look into all these non-functional requirements also with respect to choosing the real-time operating system. So this till here we discussed uh, with respect to the real-time operating system, some of the important topics. So in the next part of the chapter, we will see the integration of hardware and the firmware. So how exactly this integration of hardware and firmware is going to happen. So wait for a minute. Okay. So are you able to see the screen? Okay, so integration of hardware and firmware. Again, this is also one of the important topic you should know. See, already you have used or worked in the lab, some programs you have executed, all those things, you know already how to execute your lab programs and all. So what is the meaning of this integration of hardware and firmware means? You will be writing the programs or the software in your host machine. So nothing but your system, PC or laptop. So wherever editor or IDE is available, you will be able to write the program or code. That is nothing but your firmware. And once you are ready with the program or the firmware, so you need to execute or you need to run that on the board. So that firmware and the hardware. So you need to integrate between that. So you need to make a bridge, or you have to have communicate with that interface, like using the firmware with a hardware device. That is nothing but your board. So how or what are the different techniques which we will be using for doing that? We will be discussing that here. So embedding firmware into the target board. So you have a target board. So that is nothing but, for example, you consider your lab. In your lab, you have seen the ARM evaluation board. So that is your target board. And firmware is nothing but the program which you are writing using your system or PC or your laptop. So that is a code. So once you write the code, so you have to embed that code or interface that code or integrate that code to the target board. So which is nothing but your ARM evaluation board. So that embedding firmware into the target board is nothing but integration of hardware and the firmware. So embedding, it is also referred as embedding intelligence into the product. So intelligence is nothing but your firmware, product is nothing but your board. So you have to embed your intelligence into the product. So the embedded processor or controllers used in the target board may or may not uh, have built-in code memory. So they may not have a built-in code memory. The embedded processor or controllers which are used in the target board, they may have or may not have the built-in code memory. So for non-operating system based embedded products. So we discussed in the embedded system, sometimes you will be having operating system, sometimes you will not be having operating system. So operating systems are not necessary. For example, you will be having an embedded system which is a very small toy, simple toy, or a robo which you have done a very small robo. For that kind of embedded systems and all, you don't require operating system. So in that case, for simple applications wherein non-operating systems are available, no, it is not available. So how exactly you're going to do with this integration of firmware with the hardware? So if the processor or controller does not support built-in code memory, and then in that time you should also have external dedicated EEPROM or flash memory chips which is used for holding the firmware. So suppose your processor or microcontroller chip does not support built-in code memory, it is not going to have memory also. So that chip is not going to have operating system. If that chip is not going to have the built-in memory, code memory, then you should have a dedicated EEPROM or flash chip, flash memory chip used for holding the firmware. So that will be outside the microcontroller or the processor. So what are the different techniques you are going to use for integrating your firmware with the hardware? So firmware is nothing but the code or the software part which you have written to make that embedded system work. So hardware is nothing but your target board or board. So are the board where you are going to execute this particular firmware or the software. So how we are going to do the integration between these two, hardware and firmware? So that is the thing we are going to see here. So in the lab, you might have seen how you are going to do is, once you write the program using the Keil software, you will be using Keil and you will be typing your program in the Keil software. Once you finish typing your program, you will be following some steps to compile your program. Once the compilation is done, so you will be creating hex file. So you remember that you will be creating hex file. So hex file is nothing but your machine code. So it has generated the machine code. Once the machine code is ready or it is generated, so now that machine code or hex code which you have generated, so that should be sent to the board. So how, what technique you are going to use for sending that particular hex code from the Keil software to the board? Anyone? So how you have or which technique you have used for sending that hex file onto the board, your target board for running or executing your programs, hardware programs in the lab? So what you have used?
Flash Magic.
Flash Magic, correct. So you have used Flash Magic technique. So you'll be having a interface there, Flash Magic technique. Using that Flash Magic, so you will be able to send your that hex file onto the target board, that is your ARM evaluation board. So that image will be sent, or that hex code image will be sent to that particular a board, and there you will be doing executing that particular program. So that is what called as integrating hardware and firmware. So there are different techniques which will be used for doing this. So we will see one by one here. So the chip is interfaced to the process, like a variety of techniques are used for embedding the firmware into the target board. So here we are going to discuss among that 5 of them. So one is out of circuit programming. The second one is in system programming. Third one is in application programming, use of factory programmed chip. Fourth one, and the fifth one is firmware loading for operating based devices. So these are the 5 techniques which can be used for integrating your hardware and firmware. So whatever the firmware you write on your system, that should be integrated to the hardware or the board or the target machine. So what are the different methods used means these are the 5 important methods which will be used: out of circuit, then in system programming or ISP, then the third one is in application programming or IAP, then use of factory programmed chip, and the fifth one is firmware loading for operating based devices. So in this, when you see our LPC 2148, so which method it uses means it is supporting both in system programming as well as in application programming. So when you see the features of LPC 2148, you can remember. So these are the 2 things, integrations supported by our LPC 2148. So different controllers will use different kinds of techniques. We have to discuss one by one what exactly is this. So first one, we will take it off out of circuit programming. So in the name itself, you can see here out of circuit programming. So it is performed outside the target board. So integration of your firmware to the board will be performed outside the target board. So it will not be done inside the target board. So out of circuit programming is performed outside the target board. So suppose you have developed a code and you have executed, or you are ready with your code in your system. So in your system, your code is ready, hex file is also generated. So that you need to send it to the target board. So directly it will not be sent to the target board. So in the target, to send that code to the target board, so you're going to use out of circuit programming means that process is going to be performed outside the target board. So how that process is going to be performed outside the target board means, so in that board or the chip, you will be having a memory chip, the processor or memory chip, into which the firmware needs to be embedded. So you have to load your firmware into the memory chip. So that chip is taken out from the target board and it is going to be programmed outside the board. So in the board, you will be having a small chip for the memory. So that memory chip will be taken out from the target board, and outside that board, you will be loading your program or the firmware which you have already written, and made it ready for execution. So that hex file or the program will be loaded into that memory chip outside the board. So that is the technique they are going to use in this particular out of circuit programming. So it will be done with the help of programming devices like lab TOL 48 UXP. So this is a device they will be using. So the programming device is dedicated unit which contains the necessary hardware circuit to generate the programming signals, and then the programming device will be under control of utility program running on a PC. So in your PC, you'll be running some program, utility program. So that particular device which you are going to take out from the target board, that programming device or the chip, whatever you call, so you take out that from the board. So that will be under the control of a program which is running on a PC. So that usually the device is interfaced to PC using RS-232 or USB or parallel port. So you can use RS-232 or a serial port or USB port or parallel port. So with the help of these things, that particular chip can be connected to your PC. So the device will be interfaced to your PC, and from the PC, whatever the firmware is ready, so that will be transferred to that particular device or a chip which you have taken out from the board. So once that chip is ready or loaded with that particular firmware or the software, so then that will be inserted again back to the board. So we'll see the sequence of operations. What are the sequence of operations for embedding this particular firmware with a programmer is listed below. So how exactly that is going to be done? So the first step is connect the programming device to the specified port of PC. So after taking that programming device or the chip from the target board, you need to connect that particular device to the specified port of your PC. So where your firmware is available. Then power up the device, switch on the device, then execute the programming utility on the PC and ensure proper connectivity is established between PC and the programmer. So once you connect that particular chip or the device to your PC, so you'll be running some programming utility or utility programs on the PC, and you need to make sure that there is a proper connection between your PC and that particular programming device. Like how you connect your pen drives, all those kind of things. So same way that memory chip you are removing from the target board and you are connecting to your PC. So that connection establishment, like whether it is connected or not, you have to check. So unlock the ZIF socket by turning the lock pin. So you might have seen in the labs, in the ADE labs, so on the trainer kit, you have the slots where you insert the ICs. So you would have seen in the rightmost corner, a very big slot is there of 40 pins kind of thing. So like that, one socket will be there. So you have to unlock that. You will be having a knob for that locking and unlocking. So you have to unlock that ZIF socket by turning the lock pin, then insert the device to be programmed, whatever the chip or the memory chip you have taken out from the board. So insert that device onto that particular socket on the open socket, and then you need to one second.